Okay, so when I say the name Gutenberg, what's the first image that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's something very specific, almost saintly.
Yeah, I bet it's something like this, right? Some noble inventor, kind of bathed in this golden light, pulling a lever and just benevolently gifting knowledge to the world. It's all very clean, very pure, the birth of the modern age. But what if I told you that entire story is basically a fantasy?
Because the real story wasn't some serene moment of genius. It was a chaotic, high stakes, debt fueled nightmare. Honestly, it was a messy, high risk business venture that feels a lot more like a modern day tech startup drama than a quiet moment in a monastery.
So let's just break this down. The myth gives us the noble inventor. The reality, more like a frazzled founder probably pulling his hair out. We think of it as a gift to humanity, but really, it was an incredibly high-risk business venture. And that legendary moment of genius, it was completely buried under years and years of legal and financial battles. And that's really the best way to think about this whole thing. It's a 15th century startup story. Gutenberg, he's the brilliant founder with a world-changing idea. But like any founder, he needed one thing to make it happen: capital. And that, well, that's where all his problems began. I mean, it's one thing to have an idea for movable type. It's another thing to actually buy the lead, the tin, the vats of ink, and a giant heavy press. That stuff is expensive. So to even get his workshop off the ground, Gutenberg had to go find an investor, a financier named Johann Fust, and secure a massive loan of 800 guilders. And trust me, in the 1450s, that was an absolute fortune.
And you know how these big, ambitious projects go. That first loan wasn't enough, not even close. Costs just kept spiraling upwards. See, Gutenberg was a perfectionist, obsessed with getting his famous Bible just right. So he had to go back to Fust, cap in hand, for another 800 guilders. He was now twice as deep in debt, and his investor had all the leverage.
And it's just wild how quickly this whole thing unraveled. For 5 years, Gutenberg pours his heart and soul into this masterpiece. By 1455, he is this close to being finished. But his investor, Fust, he wasn't interested in art. He was interested in return on investment. And right at the finish line, he pulled the plug. He sued Gutenberg for all the money back, principal and interest.
And just like that, Gutenberg was ruined. He couldn't pay, all the money was tied up in the equipment, so Fust just walked in and seized the entire operation. The workshop, the press, the revolutionary type, and all those nearly finished Bibles. It was a classic hostile takeover. And to add insult to injury, Fust immediately turns around and hires Gutenberg's top assistant, a guy named Peter Schoeffer, who then marries Fust's daughter. You can't make this up. Gutenberg was kicked out of his own revolution. But Gutenberg's problem wasn't totally unique. Even for the printers who didn't get taken over by their investors, the challenges were just immense. It wasn't just about getting that startup loan. It was the crippling day-to-day cost of raw materials, specifically one thing: paper.
Yeah, paper. It's kind of hard for us to imagine because we think of paper as cheap, disposable, but back then, whoa, it was by far the single biggest expense. I mean, look at this. It could account for 60% of the entire cost of making a book. Think about that. Before you've sold a single copy, you've already sunk a fortune into blank sheets.
With that kind of insane financial pressure, you couldn't just print a book and, hope for the best. A single failed print run could literally bankrupt you overnight. So these early printers had to become incredibly savvy entrepreneurs. They had to invent new business models just to survive.
They had to hustle, and they came up with some pretty clever strategies. First, they basically invented the Kickstarter model. They'd get wealthy patrons to prepay for a book, to subscribe to it before it was printed, and use that money to buy the paper. Then they relied on a barter economy. They'd go to big book fairs and swap their unsold copies with other printers to get different titles. That way, you diversify your inventory without spending any cash. And my personal favorite, the IKEA approach, they sold books as just stacks of printed, unbound sheets. It was up to you, the customer, to take it to a binder and pay for that expensive cover yourself. Basically, flat-pack books. But even with all those clever tricks, printers needed a reliable, steady income, a cash cow. And that brings us to the product that actually paid the bills and funded the printing revolution, a dirty little secret called the indulgence slip. The difference is just staggering. On one hand, you've got the 42-line Bible. That's the prestige project. It took years, was incredibly difficult, and probably made little to no money. On the other hand, you have the indulgence slip.
This was a single sheet of paper from the church that promised you a shorter stay in purgatory. You could print them in a few hours. The church ordered them by the thousands. The profit was high and, best of all, guaranteed. This was the steady work that kept the lights on. And this is the ultimate historical irony. The printing press was funded, in large part, by selling these indulgences for the Catholic Church. And what did this new technology go on to do? Well, a guy named Martin Luther used it to mass-produce his 95 Theses, pamphlets that directly attacked the very practice of selling indulgences. The system literally paid for the tool that would eventually help to dismantle it.
So, why does all this financial drama from 600 years ago actually matter? Why should we care about this gritty, messy version of the story?
Well, it's because it perfectly illustrates this concept of the material conditions of thought. It's this idea that progress isn't just about brilliant ideas popping into someone's head. You can have the most world-changing idea in history, but if you can't afford the materials, if you can't pay for your paper, whatever that may be, your idea just dies. And that is the key takeaway here. The printing press didn't sweep across Europe simply because it was a noble invention. It succeeded because scrappy entrepreneurs and hustlers figured out how to make it profitable. It reminds us that human progress is often messy, driven just as much by loans, lawsuits, and the hustle as it is by pure genius. So the next time you pick up a book, don't just think about the author's brilliant idea. Think about the frazzled printer who took out a loan, the risky investment in paper, and all the business deals that had to happen to make it possible. Because history isn't just made of ideas, it's made of invoices. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What great invention today do you think has a similarly messy story behind it?